Hi, everyone. Welcome to CMNCP22, the annual conference of the Canadian Municipal Network on Crime Prevention. My name is Alicia and I work for CMNCP. Before we begin, I'd like to just acknowledge that I am joining you from Hamilton, which is situated on the traditional territories of the Erie, Neutral, Huron-Wendat, Haudenosaunee, and Mississaugas. Thank you all for joining us for this year's conference, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to our session titled Restorative Justice to Address Social Challenges at a Local Level. This session will be moderated by Chris Cowie and will include presentations by Dayna Arron, Audrey Barrett, Jennifer Llewellyn, and Christianne. Because we want to make sure each panelist has enough time for their presentation and that we have an opportunity to take some questions at the end, we won't be reading out the full bios of our moderators. However, we do encourage that participants refer to our website where we have the full bios to learn more about our wonderful presenters. And so without further ado, I'm pleased to welcome our moderator for this session, Chris Cowie. Chris is an executive director at the Community Justice Initiatives in Waterloo. Thank you for agreeing to take part in this session, and I'll hand it over to you to start our conversation off.
Thank you. Really happy to be here today. I have a lot of opportunities to talk about restorative justice and have over many, many years. And I never tire, and I never, my passion never wanes for this subject. I think it's just such an important thing. And as the years go by and I see an increased number of people that are actually involved and interested in the subject and more stuff happening all the time, I'm just very, very encouraged by that. So I'm very pleased to be able to moderate this session and to be able to hear about some of the work that's happening in other places and some of the developments that are there. And so I'm looking forward to hearing from our panelists this morning. It is an interesting subject as we talk about restorative justice to address social challenges at the local level, really how restorative justice can enhance safety and really yield a more satisfying kind of justice for those who have been criminalized and victimized at a local level. I want to just begin by just sharing a little bit about the work that we do at Community Justice Initiatives in Waterloo region. A lot of people are familiar with our origin story. Our organization began back in 1974 with the Elmira case, and the organization kind of grew out of that. And back then, I mean, the term restorative justice really was applied to a very narrow set of things that would happen, and mainly in the area victim offender reconciliation or victim offender mediation kind of work. And we've carried on that work. We have a very good relationship with our local crowns, and we do a lot of victim offender reconciliation that comes where the referrals come directly from the Crown's office, both with mainly with adults and with young offenders as well. But over the years, we began to see how just bringing a restorative lens to a whole variety of different kinds of community conflict and problems really could enhance our delivery of just resolving conflict. And so we have programs where we address a lot of specifically within our seniors community. We do a lot of work in our local schools, applying restorative justice to the school situation. We have a large reintegration program that we operate out of Grand Valley Institution, which is the largest women's federal prison in the country, which we have here in Kitchener. We also have a number of programs that address sexual harm, all through a restorative lens, working both with survivors and with those who have committed sexual offenses, and also working with families and doing facilitated dialogue where there has been long-term sort of historical sexual abuse. And so over the years, those have been at times fairly controversial, and yet now we just can't keep up with the volume of referrals that we get as people begin to see the real value in restorative ways of being able to address those things. We also do a lot of work just in workplaces, trying to develop more restorative habits within workplaces. We developed a program called SULA a couple of years ago in response to seeing a large amount of Islamophobia showing up in our community. And so worked in partnership with the Coalition of Muslim Women, a rather active group in our community, to develop a restorative response to what is typically called hate crime or identity-based harm, and it expands into other areas as well. And that's a program that's getting a lot of traction these days, and a whole variety of other programs that we offer as well. So there are so many different places in which we see conflict in our communities, and generally speaking, when we zero in on how those things are addressed, what we see by and large is a punitive model that's being brought to the table, one where it's generally a third party that takes a look at the situation and tries to determine who has been the person who's done wrongdoing, or the parties that have done that, and then bring about some sort of a punishment. And really, we look at it from a very different perspective of trying to empower the people who have been directly involved in conflict, and not having that third party always make the decisions. So we really hope in our community that the more and more of this that we do, we actually elevate people's capacity to be able to resolve conflict in a much smarter and more satisfying kind of way. And those are the things that we're seeing. And so we're in the midst of trying to develop what we really want is to make a restorative region, to have Waterloo Region a place where restorative responses are embedded within all of the systems that we see in every place where we see conflict. Also just wanted to mention, and this will probably come up with some of our panelists as well, that some of the focus on restorative justice has changed over the years as different pieces of language have come in. The term restorative practice is often used, sometimes synonymous with what a restorative model would be. Other times it's now increasingly come to mean a set of practices that can be done in a more proactive kind of way, where not necessarily in response to a conflict, but doing things in circle, for instance, in the absence of a conflict, but just in the interest of being a vehicle that helps to accelerate people's ability to develop deeper relationships and listening skills and empowering people, those kinds of things, and programs that are designed to promote inclusion where we see a certain exclusivity. Those types of things have come to be called restorative practices at times. So we actually can apply restorative principles in a proactive way. We don't need to necessarily be always in response to a conflict. And also the term transformative justice, which I will say has a number of different meanings to different people, and it's an ongoing conversation. And so I think it's really important that we sort of put that out there. Transformative justice kind of recognizes that when we move toward a restorative justice model in order to be able to resolve some kind of conflict, whether that's between two people where harm has taken place or a larger group, if we only seek to reconcile that particular situation, we're not really looking deep enough. And so as we look to some of the more systemic drivers of what caused that conflict, we feel that there's a responsibility to also be addressing those things. Sometimes that means creating brand new systems to be able to deal with conflict, because the old ones are simply so broken that they don't really work. And other times being able to bring about some change within those systems. And sometimes that falls within this idea of transformative justice. And I know we're going to hear a little bit more about that as well. But it's interesting just to see that the field itself, since its beginning, has really changed and opened up a much wider variety of things that we feel responsible for in the movement. And so very pleased to be able to hear about some of the work that's being done in other communities and other thoughts around these things. So I want to just begin by introducing our first panelist. And before I do that, though, I just want to mention that there will be some time for questions at the end of the session, but we want to leave those questions to the end. However, if you feel like putting questions within the chat, they can be, we'll pick them up later and ask after all of the speakers have had a chance to present. So our first speaker today is Christianne Paras, and Christianne is currently the Executive Director of the Restorative Justice Association of British Columbia. She has over 20 years of experience as an accomplished facilitator with expertise in a variety of practice models, including victim offender dialogue, family group conferencing, and peacemaking circles. Christianne is also the co-founder for Reclaiming Our Own Truth and Stories, a consulting and training organization on anti-racism, anti-oppression, and decolonization practices in restorative justice, as well as an instructor at Simon Fraser University. So good to have you with us, Christianne, and I will let you present to us now.
Thank you, Chris. I'm going to just share my screen now with our attendees. Naimbag nga bigat, gagayam, siyak ni Christianne Paras, Iloco ken Kapampanganak, nagapuak ijay Ilocos, adta Pilipinas, niyam adadtoyak, bisita ak lang itoy lugar titikwitlam nga tattao. Good morning, friends. My name is Christianne Paras. I am Ilocano from my mother's side and Kapampangan from my father's side. I am from the Ilocos region of the Philippines, which is its colonized name, and I'm currently calling in as an uninvited guest on the traditional unceded lands of the Coquitlam peoples. And so I want to speak a little bit about restorative justice in British Columbia specifically. Restorative Justice Association of BC, as Chris introduced, is the association that I'm currently working for. We support many members, which include restorative justice programs called Community Accountability Programs, CAPS, and Indigenous Justice Programs, IJPs, across British Columbia. These programs work with police, Crown Council, schools, universities, correctional institutions, and diverse BC communities to support and facilitate restorative responses to a range of matters involving harm, crime, and conflict. I just want to share with you the mission for our association, working together to strengthen and advancing restorative justice in BC. Our vision is to envision a province where restorative justice is known for quality, accessibility, and innovation. Those are very important pillars in our work. So to have a better understanding of restorative justice, specifically in BC, as the use of restorative justice expanded in British Columbia, various fields of practice and movements contributed to its growth. Indigenous justice, victims' rights, penal abolition, mediation, conflict resolution, community justice, faith communities, and transformative justice. Just a bit of a timeline. Historically, restorative justice was first used in BC in 1982, which was the first formal victim offender mediation reconciliation case. Another pivotal moment that impacted the development of restorative justice is the creation of the National Aboriginal Justice Strategy in 1991. A few years later, the RCMP initiated the first Community Justice Forum project, which is one of the models of restorative justice still used today across BC. But just in being mindful of time, for a more detailed timeline of restorative justice in BC, you can go to this website and you'll be able to find more information of how the development of restorative justice in BC happened. And so I want to talk about the different programs in our province. There are 52 community accountability programs, which, as I said, these providers receive referrals at various stages of the criminal justice system and from various sources, including police, Crown, schools, and community. There are also 25 cultural-based and community-driven programs under the Justice Canada's Indigenous Justice Program. Now, we conducted a listening project in 2021, and we, according to the results of RJABC's listening project, most programs reported operating in the Lower Mainland, Sunshine Coast, and Vancouver Island area. The highest number of responses to our listening project came from community accountability programs or police-based programs. Although 7 responses were from programs that operate province-wide or offer RJ at a post-secondary institution. Now, I want to speak about operating budgets in restorative justice programs in our province. From the listening project, an overwhelming number of programs are operating on a budget of less than $100,000 a year. There were no responses to the question around budgets between $200,000 and up. There were a handful that operate with $300,000 or more per year. But again, we did have responses from province-wide programs and post-secondary institutions. A closer look at programs, however, we identified many programs who have low operating budgets from $10,000 to $40,000 annually. with a high number of programs with just a $10,000 budget. So community accountability programs receive a modest annual funding of $4,000 per year. And that's to cover administrative expenses and volunteer training. There are also project-based funding that's made available through civil forfeiture grant. To give some context, in 2020-2021, $1 million was provided to 33 RJ-related projects, but this funding stream is specific to projects and not core funding. That means that those programs, those projects are essentially limited by a time frame to which they need to be completed. And that money runs out at the end of that funding year. I can't speak on funding for Indigenous justice programs. I only know that the province of BC, in partnership with the federal government, invests $3.8 million in funding to support these IJPs. Why is this important? Why is this information important? This will hopefully give you some insight on the diversity of RJ programs across our province and their differing capacities to meet the needs of individuals and communities. Some programs are well-funded due to additional funding sources that enable them to have adequate staffing and training opportunities for increased awareness and capacity building. Now, this brings me to our mission and vision, my association's mission and vision. What are we working on as a way of addressing the disparity between programs and also supporting increasing awareness and capacity building for those programs? We have a couple of projects that we're currently working on. We have a provincial restorative justice leadership committee. This committee is comprised of key partners from across the province. The committee's purpose is to collaborate on supporting the advancement of restorative justice in BC by sharing ideas, offering strategic advice to justice partners, and develop a coordinated commitment to increase the use of restorative justice in criminal matters. This committee has just recently formed, and we're going to be having our second meeting next week, actually. So it's a very exciting group to be coming together. We're also really excited to announce that RJABC is going to be hosting our first provincial symposium next year in the spring. After several years of gathering online, we're especially excited to be hosting the symposium in person. And we're looking forward to bringing the community of practitioners and programs together, an opportunity to learn and to connect with each other after so many years of being isolated. Now, when I spoke about the disparity of funding, which leads to disparity of training and accessibility to resources, the foundational RJ training initiative that RJABC is taking on will be a 3-year project. So we will be designing, developing, and delivering a foundational restorative justice training. This training will be offered first to select trainers from 4 regions. The trainers will then deliver the foundational course to their respective regions. The hope and intention for this project is address the disparity of access to training in our province. By identifying and supporting trainers in various regions and offering this free training for 3 years, we hope to increase capacity and accessibility to learning opportunities and mentorship. We also have a privacy and privilege project. RJABC will be working with Infinity Law to assess and identify parameters of confidentiality and privilege information in restorative practice and processes. The purpose of this project is to explore and address the lack of existing legislative safeguards to protect clients and service providers in restorative justice. So these are some of the projects that we're currently working on to support the programs who are our members of the association. Lastly, we are developing an anti-racism and anti-hate strategy. A little bit of background information about this particular initiative. In 2021, a team of student consultants from Northeastern University, in collaboration with Restorative Justice Association of BC, conducted a literature review as well as interviews and a focus group with Indigenous, Black, and practitioners of color to explore the following questions. What are the emerging concerns for restorative justice in regards to racism and hate crimes? who are the necessary stakeholders in implementing a provincial or regional anti-racism strategy, what collaborative efforts and partnerships have been formed for restorative justice and anti-racism work, what regulatory frameworks support anti-racism strategies as well as policies and practices, what are the internal and external policies necessary for a provincial and organizational anti-racism strategy, and lastly, what forms of trainings are included in an anti-racism strategy. As a result of this research, the student consultant team identified emerging concerns around equity, diversity, and inclusion in restorative justice. So they compiled examples of anti-racism strategies across North America, Canada, and the United States, Europe, Africa, Asia, and Australia and New Zealand, and put forward recommendations for RJABC to develop and establish a anti-racism strategy for Britain. The recommendations offered by the student consultant team aims to provide RJABC to necessary tools and resources to inspire sustainable racial equity and in restorative justice circles, conferences, victim offender mediations, and the field in general throughout the province. So at this time, the RJABC board and staff are continuing to explore next steps in developing an anti-racism and anti-hate strategy based on the recommendations in the 2021 Anti-Racism Strategy Report. We have identified the need for internal organizational work first and have begun our work in cultural safety with Harley Eagle. And so these are a lot of the work that we're doing and we're engaged in over in BC. The hope is that, we are expanding restorative justice in the province in a way that, expands the access of restorative justice. As a person of color, as a woman of color, I have found restorative justice to not always be restorative for me. What I have seen in the last few years is a very divided conversation, and it seems to be coming from a place of either or. It's coming up a lot in many, many, many gatherings where it becomes this mainstream restorative justice versus Indigenous justice. Or it's a conversation about, there's a tension, a very nuanced tension about the two streams of restorative justice. The concern that's been coming up for me is that the mainstream restorative justice system still operates from a very colonial and white supremacy culture. And as a result, many marginalized and racialized groups are experiencing harm in accessing such spaces and processes. So the hope in engaging in all of this capacity building and transformation work for our association is to address those gaps and systemic issues that hopefully will shift restorative justice, and that folks like myself can access restorative justice in a way that is truly holistic and healing and honoring of identity. And so that is for me. Agyamanak unay, salamat, and thank you.
Thank you, Christianne. Sorry, the screen went a little funny there, and I had a hard time locating my my unmute button. Thank you so much. That was an excellent presentation. And so we're missing one of our speakers at the moment. So we're still hoping, she's just having some difficulty getting to the on the Zoom call. So we hope that she'll be able to make it later. But our next person up is Audrey Barrett. So I'd like to introduce Audrey. And Audrey is the Director of Restorative Justice Initiatives Unit in the Department of Justice in Nova Scotia. She specialized in the areas of social context, judicial independence, criminal law, and evidence law education, specifically in relation to restorative justice and justice reform. Audrey has published and presented on topics such as the role of community in sustainable restorative justice programs, defining alternative dispute resolution, and the use of discourse in strengthening community and social cohesion. So take it away, Audrey. We look forward to your presentation.
Thanks so much, Chris. I'm hoping I'm coming through okay. Good. Okay. I saw a thumbs up. Thanks so much. So I'm actually, the next 15 minutes is going to be myself along with Jennifer Llewellyn in the Nova Scotia context. It's kind of the way we work down here. When an invitation came out to present today, you'll see from what I'm going to say and what Jennifer says, there really is a deep commitment to a particular way of working in Nova Scotia, one that is holistic, relational, integrated, and really working against those traditional silos. So I'll do about 5 minutes and then hand it over to Jennifer, but we're both speaking to you from Nova Scotia today. I think we'll start, Jen, if you can flip to the next slide, with a couple of points, and I'll just pick up on I'll pick up a couple of points that were made both by Chris and Christianne. First, you'll definitely hear some differences in language and the way we use language. I know, as someone in this field for the last 15, 20 years, the language has definitely evolved and continues to evolve. I think it's an exciting thing that when you're on the forefront of a different way of working, a different way of imagining justice, we get to understand and work with each other to come up with common understanding around language. So it's exciting. It can be confusing sometimes, but I'll take it as an exciting moment, knowing that we're sort of those forerunners in some ways. That leads me to the second point is Jennifer and I are going to speak predominantly about the Nova Scotia Restorative Justice Program and a restorative approach in Nova Scotia. In terms of the program side that I'll speak about, we do in that vein, as Christianne was talking about, in honoring those roots of restorative justice. We have partners in Indigenous justice in what they would term customary law here in Nova Scotia. I would never speak for, nor would I ever imagine understanding or being able to represent those views. We work hand in hand with our partners. We learn from each other. We grow together. We have a lot more learning to do. But just a note here that what I'll speak about, especially on the program side of things, is the Nova Scotia Restorative Justice Program and not the customary law piece. So let me quickly then run through just some of the history. Our Nova Scotia Restorative Justice Program started in 1999. We've had 20 odd years here in Nova Scotia. So on the older side of that, not the Indigenous justice per se or customary law, but again, I'm speaking specifically to the Nova Scotia Restorative Justice Program. In 2006, there was the NSRJ Cura, really a work, and you'll see this theme, work between government, academics, and community here in Nova Scotia. So the Community University Research Alliance in 2006 sort of brought people together to think about how we institutionalize restorative justice while maintaining its principles and roots. As others have talked about their use of a restorative approach spreading, ours did too, in terms of a healing approach to senior safety. Most of our work was done with youth in the early days, and then in 2011 and then 2016, a pilot and then a rollout across the province of using restorative justice in terms of adults here in Nova Scotia. Lots being learned then, and moving to thinking about an integrated approach. So a renewal was undertaken in 2017. The government here in Nova Scotia committed some specific resources in terms of our unit within the Department of Justice, the Restorative Initiatives Unit, and the work that was done over those years, 2017, 2018, resulted in a renewed NSRJP that was launched in 2019 that really paid attention to that community, government, stakeholders, relationships, really engaged us or recommitted us to a principled approach We have new protocols and a new principle-based practice guide that came out of that, and an MOU that sort of binds us collectively in terms of our collective responsibility and ownership towards the health and well-being of the program here in Nova Scotia. I did say, although you'll see differences from the regions, you'll also see some of the similarities, that Christianne talked about, that we'll talk about, that others may. And I'll invite you to look, you can Google the key elements of success document. There was an FPT document put forward a number of years ago. And I can provide a link later for it, that really, as a country, sort of guided us to think about what were the key elements that were leading to success in the different jurisdictions across Canada. So although we've got our regional differences, although we're all learning and growing in different ways and responding to the circumstances in each of our communities, we also have been learning together to come up with talking about what works and what doesn't work. We have, as we'll talk about, government's commitment here in Nova Scotia broadened from a restorative justice approach to thinking more of an approach to justice. This slide, if we stay in the typical criminal justice realm, we've seen restorative justice be helpful in terms of thinking of an alternative justice pathway in the justice system. I know our history has been one of thinking about alternative justice, then sort of moving along to, well, how do we reform the system? Really what underpinned our renewal a number of years ago was this understanding of the need for transformation, that restorative justice at its part done well is transformative. And so I think a couple other things that I don't want to forget is in terms of key to our success in this has been, as mentioned already, the collaboration and commitment to partnering and working alongside communities and the diversity of communities that we have to work in holistic and integrated ways. In thinking about that, in understanding humans in that holistic way and the social issues that we all encounter, it is really giving us both the opportunity, but also really required us to be thinking of not just the traditional silos of justice, but really imagining the intersection of those silos if we are really going to respond to human needs and social issues. So this slide just represents the variety of ways that we have branched out in taking up that dedication and response to working in holistic, contextual, human-centered ways. We've got our program, you can see at the top left box, but it's just one piece of the overarching ecosystem. We have worked in correctional facilities, in our schools, the response to elder abuses in here. What's been really pivotal in our province has been the restorative inquiry into what was called the Nova Scotia Home for Colored Children. Really, the report coming out of that really solidified for people that way that we have to work in integrated ways to respond to humans as whole humans. That if we keep carving up humans into the various systems or silos that our government typically carves departments up into, we're never going to respond and find solutions to the issues that we're facing. That has then led to the government of Nova Scotia committing to working in more human-centered ways. We've got a number of mechanisms that we try to do that and animate that that are noted there. We've had some real interesting responses to COVID as well in working this way. And then, as you would have seen on the national scale, the Mass Casualty Commission really starting to embed some of those restorative principles in its work as well. My last point before I send it over to Jennifer is really just this reiteration of, you can clearly see this isn't owned by government and can't be owned. I am speaking from government, but you'll see this is why I'm coming alongside some of my community partners with Jennifer. We can't do this successfully if it's just housed in one particular silo. We have to work together. We have to share that responsibility and that power. And I think in Nova Scotia, one of the key pieces is that commitment in a different way of being together and working together. So with that, Jennifer, I'll hand it over to you to finish us off.
Great. I'll do Chris's job so that he doesn't have to waste time saying who I am. I'm Jennifer Llewellyn. I work at the law school at Dalhousie at the Schulich School of Law here in Mi'kmaq, the unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people, and count myself as extremely lucky to be allowed to live and learn and work here as an uninvited guest. I also direct a place called the Restorative Lab, which is actually the product of all of these kinds of relationships and connections between government, community, and the university here. And I have a little slide that'll direct you towards the lab. In case some of our work might be of more interest to you. So I wanted to just pick up where Audrey left off and just say a few words about what I think might be interesting and important about all of the stories and experiences that we're sharing today here, particularly for those working within municipalities and thinking about how a restorative approach might be important and key for the work that you do. One of the things that marks the experience in Nova Scotia and the experience more broadly in terms of the development and evolution of restorative justice, at least as it's been taken up, particularly at this level of thinking beyond the criminal justice system or beyond being captured by our legal system, to actually think about it as an approach to justice. I think one of the things, picking up on Chris's earlier comments about how things have been developing and evolved, is that I want to push us to be really cautious of thinking that the lessons we should take from the experience of restorative justice in the criminal justice system is that there are some practices and processes that we can lift from there and use for just generalized making people get along. It's true that a restorative approach is relational, but I think what it also invites us to do, and this is to Audrey's point about this transformation of the way we think about justice, that's not just for the legal system. That's for when we start thinking about the justice challenges we're all facing, many of which emerge for municipalities and in the communities in which we live. It becomes really clear that we can't address the justice challenges of our time by hoping that the criminal justice system or the legal system will fix those, that those justice moments, both in terms of conflict and in terms of how do we respond in a proactive and preventative way so we're building just societies and just communities. How do we do that justice work? So I kind of want to push us to say, restorative practices aren't just for when there's conflict. They're actually always about doing justice, about building just relations. And that, when we start to think restoratively, happens when there's conflict and has to happen to ensure that there isn't. So it's for when things are going wrong, and it's what do we need from one another to ensure they go right more often. And that is so urgent right now, as we recognize that lots of the injustices aren't just happening at an interpersonal level, but are systemic and longstanding and are part of our histories, and that then the injustices we do to one another, the harms we do to one another, are often connective and reflective of that larger context. And so that's part of, I think, what the real promise is in this moment, and why the conversation is starting to push the boundaries of where restorative justice may be used in the criminal justice system, to push the boundaries to talk about how can we be like this more often together, that big slide of squares where it's all over the place in Nova Scotia, and also how are we pushing the boundary to ensure that restorative justice is never just this narrow focus on helping people get along, but is transformative of the way in which we relate. That's what we mean by a restorative approach. How are we starting to change the way we see the world and the way we respond? And then that has a bunch of practices and processes. I think I just want to point out, so that's what this slide says. Look, this isn't just a tool in our toolkit. It ain't just about the processes. It's what those practices and processes represent and why we think we've got to start acting differently with one another. When we say it's not then just about particular models or practices or processes, as Audrey reflected, what's common across all of those different areas where we're starting to try to show up in a more just way together in Nova Scotia is that we're working from these principles. And they're not just a plaque for the wall. They're not just what we like, what we value. They're how we figure out what to do. They're when we're designing systems, when we're thinking about funding processes, when we're thinking about changing policies, everything from what do we do about the kind of funding for policing and other ways we keep each other safe to how are we going to actually build schools. We try to think through these principles that will help us act and proceed differently. And so that's what a restorative approach, not approaches or a bunch of practices, that's what underlies all of those different ways of doing. And we really think, and this is where this session is so key for municipalities, I think, is that this is not just appropriate to the kind of jurisdiction that provinces have or that the federal government has over the legal system and the sort of formalized justice system, but if it is about building just and healthy communities that are inclusive, that are strong and healthy, that are all of those kind of sustainable development goals around what cities and communities are going to look like and what they need in order to face the kind of complex challenges. That sort of integrated and holistic approach to kind of make sure that we look at what is happening that requires response and what's connected to it. That a restorative approach is core to the challenges facing municipalities and at all levels. So not just in terms of what programs you might create in order to do more of this work around housing, around recreation, around inclusive communities, around building transport and sustainable development goals and urban development, but also how you get there. So governance that is more collaborative and inclusive of the multiplicity of voices in our communities. And a restorative approach has a lot to say, and there's experience from all of these folks you're hearing from in Waterloo, in Halifax, across communities in BC, and more broadly about how we're striving. We haven't figured it all out, but we've got some lessons to teach about how we're striving to bring people together to work in these more connected, integrative, holistic, relationally centered ways. That's required for the complexity of the challenges we face. And so that's moving to be more human-centered, requires connecting the dots on what human beings need, moving away from just helping people navigate our existing systems to be really being transformative of the way in which we try to work and to working in more comprehensive and holistic ways. That's kind of the work, the premise that the lab's been engaged in. So we're not a center, we don't just study people, we are sort of like this living, learning wet lab where we can bring people together to try hard things in real time and to see where that can get us in terms of innovating and trying to do things differently, learning from those efforts and sharing all of the successes and the failures in real time. And so happy to be connected or to be a connector, which is mostly what we do, between any of you who are interested in this work and work happening other places. Audrey shared some of the work here of developing this sort of Team RJ in Nova Scotia, people who can find one another and help one another try to do things differently along this journey and this path to being more restorative as a province. We're aiming to do that at a community level as well, because we know that municipalities and communities are the level at which they can connect the dots most quickly, because the people and their integrated problems and needs are right in front of us every day. And so they can, we see municipalities and communities as a real engine for transforming the way in which we see the world and what's required for justice. There's a network of folks across the country who are interested in this called the Smart Justice Network. And the lab hosts an international learning community that includes jurisdictions around the world who are trying to become more restorative communities. And so there's actually a webinar at the Zaire Institute that you can look up if you just Google Zaire Institute webinar happening on the 16th of November that brings some of those international voices together. And so happy to leave it there and turn it back to you, Chris.
Thank you so much. Sorry, my screen's doing all kinds of funny things here. There we go. Thank you so much. That was wonderful. Do we have Dayna with us, Oshi? Or oh yeah,
Yes.
I think I see. Okay, fine. So I will introduce Dayna. Glad that you could be with us, Dayna. So let me just introduce Dayna, and then she can do her presentation. Dayna is an executive director of the Justice Centers at the Criminal Law Division, Ministry of Attorney General. And in this role, she's developed considerable experience facilitating cross-ministerial collaboration, and is also currently responsible for leading 15 cross-ministry initiatives under the Ministry of Attorney General's provincial strategy on guns, gangs, and violence reduction. So good that you could be with us, and you can take it away and give us your presentation now.
Thanks, Chris. So I'm going to need Oishi to help me. I'm actually here in Kenora, and we're going to sort of do this as a team. So thank you very much for having me here today. I'm here to talk about Ontario's work on justice centers. And if you just jump forward, Oishi, and have to do it this way, really, we've been taking a restorative approach through this work in Ontario, and really nice to sort of hear all the other speakers and and know that we're sort of following the restorative principles and approaches, and an opportunity for justice transformation and collaboration with cities and communities across all sectors through the work that we're embarking on in Ontario. So really, this presentation is about, well, how do we take these restorative approaches, and how have we in Ontario tried to put them into practice within this box that we call justice centers? Each one is unique. So I'll try to, in the time that I have, take you through the work that we're doing, and happy to answer any questions, because as you'll come to see, the work that we've done in each of the communities is very different. So if you jump forward. So really, as I said, we are working on justice centers in Ontario in 4 different communities: Toronto Downtown East, Toronto Northwest, London, Ontario, and Kenora. And really, in doing this, we have really drawn on sort of innovative justice and community restorative justice practices and multi-sector approaches from jurisdictions around the world. And we began this work really grounding it in community with a really in-depth needs assessment to understand how is justice working, how is it not working, and how can we work better and differently across sectors through this work, and testing it out in Ontario in terms of what works, what doesn't. And so if you jump forward, Oishi, really, I just want to take a moment because sometimes everybody works in the space of community justice centers differently. In Ontario, what we've really tried to do, and we did work with the Centre for Court Innovation in the development of this model, and we do work with municipalities in each of our locations, is taking justice out of a traditional courtroom and integrating it within a community setting. Really, the driving force is to really work across all sectors to get at the reasons that are bringing people into the criminal justice system. We really, as a system, as you all know, we're not equipped to address the social determinants of health. And yet we really are the place in which we can try to use an intersection with the criminal system as an opportunity to prevent re-entry into the criminal justice system. But the answer doesn't lie in hiring more and more police officers or crowns or judges. It really is sort of bringing the different pieces of community into a place where we can really try to look at individuals and their families holistically. And it isn't simple, for sure, but how do we really sort of take a whole of government, a whole of community approach in doing this work, which is really daunting and ambitious. And so really this presentation is to say, well, how have we tried to do this in different ways in Ontario? And I, on the behalf of the Criminal Law Division, I work across government at the highest of levels, but also just down on the ground in community, because that really is where the magic lies. So if we jump forward, we also, in doing this, I think, in taking a client-centered, systems approach to this work, we work on sort of interministerial evaluation. Justice, has been okay at understanding our own justice indicators. But what's really, I think, important in the future of this work is to understand sort of how they intersect with housing, health, mental health, in a disaggregated way, in a way that we can really understand the drivers and the inputs, and where we can try to address gaps that help people in communities. You'll see we're working in Kenora, where we take an Indigenous focused, Indigenous-led evaluation approach, working on sort of the tools to try to collect both justice data and community data as we bring them together to better serve people and to help the people working in this space, as well as sort of the infrastructure planning and interministerial collaboration. So there's all these big pieces, but I really want to take you into what does it look like on the ground to try to do this in the models that we've developed in Ontario, mindful that everybody does this differently. So if you jump forward, really want to begin by talking about the model. It was the first of our justice centers in Ontario to launch, and these are often called community justice centers around the world, or community courts. And really, we in Ontario call them justice centers. But in London, after working in community on a very in-depth needs assessment, it was decided that we would start working with young adults 18 to 24. There had been a study done in Ontario about this population, often who are not otherwise in education, training, and employment. And as we worked through COVID, really sort of struggling with mental health and addictions, and how do we sort of take a very tailored approach to this emerging adult population who often fall through the cracks when you start to lose the supports you have as a young person in the criminal justice system and in sort of community. So this working sort of across sectors, and with the Ontario Court of Justice in London, we developed sort of a youth in transition pilot model. And if you jump forward, we'll just show you how that works. And really what some of our, I'll show you how it works, but also just tell you that, what have we been able to achieve since, starting this work. So again, you as a city probably, won't, it's not a priority for municipalities in terms of how quickly do individuals get their disclosure, how quickly do they get to court. But the truth is sort of disruption by the criminal justice system and, languishing in the criminal justice system has an impact on your sort of broader community outcomes. So we've been able to get young people into court faster, meeting with duty counsel, taking the time from arrest and when you come into the criminal justice system to meet with a community caseworker to really identify, not just what you're charged with, but who you are, what's going on, how can we as a system, by working with communities, really mobilize around you to really create a pathway quickly out of the justice system and into community where we can end your criminal matters but your continuity of care and community continues. And so we, through just in an early snapshot of outcomes, have been able to reduce the number of days of jail, reduce the number of days on probation, which often leads to breaches, which often leads to costs for municipalities, for corrections, for the justice system, and really doesn't often in the appropriate cases lead to sort of the holistic and restorative outcomes. We, through this work in London, have been able to achieve by these early intake, community-based intakes with community partners, been improving the employment outcomes for young adults in London, in London by 47%, as well as sort of focusing on mental health outcomes. And so really an intersection with the criminal justice system in London for this population through our pilot has really allowed these young people to sort of go back on, get back into work, get a job, get back into school and really receive the mental health supports and community that they need. And I'll just jump forward because I'm realizing we have all of our pilots here. If you just jump forward and people often say, well, how does this thing work? We take these broad principles. We say we want to work across sectors and we want to support people coming into conflict with the law, but how do we bring all these people together? And really, this is just a pathway. And we launched in COVID, which was a challenge for us in Ontario, but really harnessing the strength of virtual court appearances, but keeping people, we work out of Youth Opportunities Unlimited, which is an amazing youth hub in London, Ontario, which has an on-site social enterprise cafe that we support, that has housing, and we sort of bring people through virtual court processes while they are supported by a breadth of community partners across sectors. And we work in collaboration with the London Police Service and all multi-sector community partners to support young adults themselves through this model and really looking at all of the different pieces of people's needs, if they have them. And if they don't, we get them in and out quickly. So really that's been the model in London, but I want to jump forward to, take you briefly through, because I always realize it sounds good to go through all of 4 of Ontario's pilots, but it's very hard to do in a short time. So just wanted to say it's really important, and what we've learned in Ontario is taking a really tailored approach to what communities telling you they need, and working across sectors. So in Toronto Northwest, we're working with youth 12 to 17 under the YCJA. This spans 6 different police divisions, working with communities who are struggling. These are the areas with the highest number of shootings in Ontario communities. And we working with, and I think as we've all learned, when we take a restorative approach, when you're working with youth, it's not just the youth. You have to provide the supports. We provide equal supports to parents as we do to siblings of the youth when they come in, should they want. And we are working, as you'll come to see in the next slide, we started off in this pilot, and again, because we're just piloting it and we're just starting with a certain subset of cases, but every single youth who comes into the criminal justice system has this community intake. And then we keep a certain portion of them. We've focused on robberies, often a gateway offense to more significant offending, as we've seen, sometimes escalating into gun violence, and taking a holistic and wraparound approach to those high-risk youth. And if you just jump forward, please, you can see that, through this enhanced first appearance pilot, where we're getting kids and their families in, explaining, what the criminal, what the charges are, what this new model is about, how we're connecting you to community agencies, and referrals to 37 different agencies where kids can see themselves within the agencies that are closer to them. Often in a courthouse, you have 1 or 2. We are connecting into the agencies that are just closest on the ground, taking a culturally relevant approach to working with, Black and racialized youth. We've created and funded an amazing program with Delta Family Services, which is just grounded in sort of like identity, which is broken out into 17 different modules and has really proven to be a significant and sort of a new approach for us in supporting youth and their families. We've actually brought in an education advocate because we know for kids, keeping them in school and really having a legal advocate to help keep them in school and working across sectors is really, really important. So our outcomes, as you can see, for youth in terms of their education outcomes, just by intersection with the criminal justice system, which you don't often think, usually it disrupts your cross-sector outcomes or your education outcomes because we have conflicting bails. It really is about all of us being accountable to the youth and the families that we're trying to serve and promoting sort of broader community safety and well-being, and just looking at kids and their families and really supporting them through this holistic approach. Mindful that some of the charges are very serious, and we're working with victims as well. Sometimes you're a victim who is also an accused in another case. So if we jump forward, and I will say this for municipalities, we work closely with the City of Toronto. Justice centers in Toronto are part of the City of Toronto's community safety wellbeing plans. All municipalities in Ontario have been mandated to do them. And so where we are working on justice centers in the sites, they are part of the city's community safety wellbeing plan. So we work with the City of Toronto at the highest levels, and it has been the magic of the successful implementation of our 2 justice centers in Toronto, because we can mobilize across high levels within the city. We can try to mobilize across, at high levels within the province and really work on the ground with some of the people doing sort of the most sort of holistic and restorative and sort of transformative work. And we intersect that with the criminal justice system, which traditionally isn't something that we've been able to do. Mindful, we're also working, we have to make sure the procedural rights of young people are maintained, and how do we balance that? So, we're not really siloed. We bring them in, we have memorandums of understanding, we have done, privacy impact assessments. We really, are careful in the sharing of information, but it is possible when you do it and you do it in the right way. And really our justice outcomes have been, significantly improved in working with police and, most importantly, the community-driven outcomes for the youth and their families. So if we jump forward, and I think I just have a couple of minutes. We're also working in the downtown east. And again, this with a population, some of the hardest to serve complex clients at the intersection of mental health, addictions, homelessness, social isolation, and developmental disability. And these are the people in the downtown core. And for folks who are here on Vancouver or elsewhere, you can have someone who's arrested on 25 different sets of charges in a given year. We have one particular client. And, how do we, work? These people in particular at 51 Division in College Park are just cycling time and time again. And so we've sort of broken out the system because many of whom don't go to mental health court, they don't go to drug treatment court, and they just come in and out of the Toronto South Detention Center. So really working with the hardest population and working with some of the agencies are on the ground who are doing outreach in COVID, and working with the city of Toronto, really across some of the best agencies and bring them all together, working with on-site addictions medicine and mental health, primary care practitioners, psychiatrists, bringing these things to people to really try to prevent and provide the continuity of care and support that is really low barrier, and trying to reduce the number of breaches. When you're arrested on 25 different offenses and you have 25 conflicting bails, the number of bench warrants and rearrests is just unsustainable. So really taking, and if you jump forward, an approach that's just grounded and focused on sort of a community health approach and addressing the social determinants of health, really being mindful that we have to meet people where they're at, and we have to change what we see as success. If you're arrested only 10 times in a year versus 25, that's success. If you actually are engaging once with the psychiatrist, that we have to see it success. So we really take a really dynamic and evolving approach to the evaluation of this model, and have really seen some early outcomes that are quite promising. Not all the time, I got to be honest, but really we just have been working, because I think we all recognize within the criminal justice system that what we were doing wasn't working, and we need to start thinking outside of the box, and we need to take a restorative approach. And I think in my time, I'll just take, and if we jump forward, I'm here in Kenora, and the next slide really shows you, well, how do the mechanics of it work? But I'll take just a moment to talk about Kenora. And Chris, you can cut me off because I'm trying to balance the time while doing this on my phone because my computer wasn't working. In Kenora, we really, and I in particular have been doing this work in Kenora for about 4 years now, to develop a model that focuses on Indigenous overrepresentation and healing, and just grounded in the reality that, in the knowledge that we know that over 90% of people in the Kenora jail are Indigenous, and really that's a stark, when compared to the provincial average, I mean, it just speaks for itself. So how do we take a restorative approach to every single person and individual, mindful that some of the offending is serious, and how do we do justice differently? And a quote from Bob Burney there, who just texted me actually saying, we can't arrest our way out of this. So what do we do? And working with communities. So this pilot is the last to launch. And if you jump forward, Alicia, is the last to launch, but we, as you can come to see, really took developed a unique engagement approach with Indigenous leadership from Grand Council Treaty 3 and from NAN in the broader district of Kenora, which, represents over 70 different First Nations, but really we're in the territory of Treaty 3 where we're launching this pilot. This engagement model is based on an Anishinaabe clan model. I don't do justice speaking to it, but I'm here just myself today, grounded in the 7 grandfather teaching, where we have Indigenous leadership at the center, key community partners, and then advisory council circles, all of whom feed in core issues, whether, not just limited to justice, but focusing on health and housing, education, social services, Indigenous healing, land-based healing and wellness. How do we bring all this together? How do we also work with the city? I work very closely with the Kenora District Services Board in the development of this model, really just working across all sectors and with all parties. And we're just on the cusp of having our space developed, as you'll come to see. So really, this has been a true participatory design process in Kenora, where everyone owns a bit of it, despite the fact that you are hearing and seeing me speak of it. And if you jump forward, it allows us to, just as I said, focus on overrepresentation and healing through a continuum of criminal and restorative approaches that really try and foster a sense of autonomy and agency and individuality and community within everything that we're doing, taking a trauma-informed approach at both for the people serving within this model, and both from the training that we provide and from the approach that we take, and really developing very unique pieces that are to increase the use of and accelerate diversion with wraparound supports, as well as looking at those cases that we have seen and we know where people are in custody for 5, 15, 30, 60, 180 days. I was just at the Kenora jail yesterday. We really need to be trying to take more of a community-based approach to those dispositions, cognizant that we also are working with victims and witnesses and survivors of crime, and how do we balance all of those things, but really taking, and we must, in guidance from the Ogichida and from everyone here, is taking a healing approach. Even where there has to be accountability, how do we focus on healing? And that really does take a village in Kenora and elsewhere, as you know. Chris, I'll turn it back over to you because I think I've gone over time. If you just jump forward, Oisha, just to show you here in Kenora. And this is just a bit of a snapshot of the model, but if you go forward, just one slide and then one more slide. This is the space, and this, go back one Oisha for a moment. Just this is how a community justice center space in Ontario, in Kenora, which is about 7,000 square feet, which has sort of a court space in the front, a community room, and workstations. This is modeled after the neighborhood justice center it's a smaller version in Australia, where we also deal with in custody matters, because if you leave out a focus for people who are intersecting or in custody, they lose the benefit of a restorative and healing approach. So our direction, and in working with the Ontario Court of Justice, is really to take a restorative approach to some of the more serious cases. Otherwise, those people fall through the gaps. Those people end up in corrections, and we need those people to be supported in community across all sectors, and we need to be doing this, of course, in Kenora with Indigenous leadership, Indigenous organizations, on-site elders, interpreters, and all of the multi-sector organizations. And this is the box in Kenora around which we're really trying to test out taking a restorative and healing approach that is trauma-informed and really works across systems in a transformative way here in Ontario. So I think I have gone over, and Chris, thank you for your indulgence, and Oisha, thank you for sharing the slides. We also are supporting land-based healing and wellness, which, as you all know, is just so important for justice to be investing with communities to do that work. So thank you.
Thank you, Dayna. Quite a challenge to be able to get all of that into a few minutes.
No, I'm sorry, I should have just done 2 of them.
Yes, no. Okay, thank you to all our panelists for some really good presentations and just a good understanding of some of the things that are happening in your communities there. So we've come to the end of our time. And again, I just want to thank our panelists. I want to thank Jennifer, Christianne, Dayna, and Audrey for presenting today and being able to share with us around these things. Thank you for the real clarity with that people have spoken. Where we've spoken just about the going beyond just the actual small programs and bringing people together and seeing the systemic kinds of things that we need to address, and addressing culture and doing our part just to raise a culture where we begin to see things through a much more restorative worldview. And again, I said at the beginning, something that when I began my work in restorative justice and for many years thought it would never, ever, ever see it catch on in that way. And so it's nice to see from coast to coast that people are very interested in developing different kinds of justice in our communities like that. So thank you everyone for participating, and I'm sure that we're able to get some of the materials that were presented today by reaching out to Yoshi. So very good. Thank you very much, everyone. Have a good day.